Hey there, welcome back, and I'm so excited to talk about Pesach or Passover today. But before we get into the intro and the video and all that good stuff, I do want to mention that for whatever reason, as I was recording the video for this, the video capture part, the image capture part got really corrupted and kind of jumpy and stuff, and definitely not usable, but the audio sounds great. So what I'm going to do is have this be an audio kind of only experience today after, of course, this intro. And I'll use some imagery related to Pesach, to Passover, that is appropriate, and hopefully you can kind of just listen to it in podcast form and kind of let your own imagination be the image capture, the video of it. So thank you so much for being here, and Chag Sameach. Chag Sameach, Chag Sameach, la 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 la. Chag Sameach, Chag Sameach, la 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 la. What I'm going to talk about today is Pesach, or Passover, you might know it by. And I'm recording it on Pesach, or Passover, and hopefully going to post it today. And I want to talk through the symbolism, the parts of the Seder plate, all the different kind of stories and symbolisms and allegories involved, but doing it from, at some point, it kind of feels like a little bit of a unique perspective, although I'm sure I'm not alone in this, but it just feels like I don't hear about this perspective a lot, which is what I call the Jew-ish perspective, where I was bar mitzvahed, but at the same time, I don't really have as much of a connection to my Jewish roots as I see other Jews have. And part of that is because we were not really much of a religious family growing up, even though I did have a bar mitzvah, but it was like after that, it was like, well, what now, you know? And we sort of lost touch. So in some ways, it's sort of like getting in touch with things from my childhood, and you might pick up on that. But at the same time, it's a little bit of a sort of revisitation, reinterpretation, beginner's mind through the lenses of the spiritual practice that I've developed over the last 5 years or so. There are kind of particular specific reasons for why I'm making this video. In one sense, hopefully it could somehow educate someone who maybe is not very familiar with Passover on kind of the symbolism involved. But at the same time, I recognize that it's a popular enough holiday and so vital and important to the Jewish lineage, regardless of which lineage we're talking about. But at the same time, it feels like maybe there's sort of a jaded quality to it, at least from my experience, as I said, as like a Jewish person. And, you know, I think sort of reinvigorating the symbolism through sort of an approach to how I approach my own spiritual practice now, I think could be really valuable. So, you know, if you're somebody that is not Jewish and doesn't really know anything about Passover or anything about the Seder, and this is your first time hearing it, awesome. If you're someone who's Jewish and not Jewish, but like, you know, celebrates and really appreciates the holiday and always has the Seder plate and, you know, always gets around the table with family or friends or your community, that's awesome too. And maybe there can be some, you know, value that this video can provide. But I do want to preface by saying that, you know, I was bar mitzvahed, as I said, but I did kind of drift spiritually where, you know, I was sort of identified as an atheist or at least agnostic for a while. But then as I got older, I really found like a spiritual home in different traditions, or actually I would say teachings really and practices, because they weren't really like traditions in the way that like Judaism or Christianity is. Some of them sort of like Buddhism is, but even when we talk about Eastern religions, they're not really like just a religion. They're so much more than that, in a way that's hard to pin down into just being a religion, which in a way all religions are like that. But I think oftentimes like Western sort of eyes look at Eastern traditions or lineages and like puts them into the categories that the West uses. So nevertheless, I've benefited a lot. And as I talked about sort of in like my spiritual journey video, which if you want to get more context, you can watch that one. I benefited greatly from the practice of mindfulness, or really what it was meditation through a Buddhist sort of practice lens. And it really helped me throughout that time that I was growing up Jewish, when I was experiencing separation anxiety. But since then, I've really kind of taken a deep dive, you would say, or you might say, into non-duality, into the teachings of A Course in Miracles, which I'll be sort of bringing up today a little bit. And A Course in Miracles is interesting because it uses terminology of the New Testament, of Christianity, but with different interpretations. And so I'm really interested in how my spiritual practice and the teachings that I learn from nowadays can kind of be applied and used to interpret a practice, a teaching, a tradition, a ritual, a holiday that, sort of predates any of that, learning in form. And so it's kind of interesting to like go back to it. And this might be a series. I might revisit all different holidays that I celebrated as a kid that you might have celebrated as a kid and maybe don't anymore, or maybe you still do and could benefit from someone kind of engaging with this. But I do want to come from a place of humility here. Like, I gotta say, just to be totally vulnerable, I was like, I'm gonna pronounce all these words right? Like even though I grew up, I had a bar mitzvah, I have the muscle memory, there's still this sort of doubt that I think I have, and I'm sure a lot of people have. Like I said, it feels unique, but I don't think it actually is. I think we just don't talk about it a lot, where there's this feeling of like, am I part of the culture or am I not? And even though I grew up with it, I also feel a sense of having sort of drifted, like I mentioned. So this video is sort of like a return to the table, right? A return to the table where we look at the Seder plate and we talk about it and we explore the themes and the symbolism, but returning to it as someone who is bringing my whole self forward. And I hope you can bring your whole self forward, whether you're actually physically in form in front of the Seder plate today, tonight, tomorrow, or you're just thinking about it in terms of how can I honor this tradition and this holiday, this ritual, but through the lens of the inner journey. So definitely for anyone who feels Jewish, but for anyone who feels spiritually called, even if you're not religiously tethered, I think we can understand and appreciate the rituals within the context that they were formed in, but recognize that they were never meant to be anything but universal. At least that's my perspective. So it's not just about sort of like, what can I learn here, from exploring this, but about reclaiming something that is so ancient and so vital, but also making it new, making it contemporary, not just for tradition's sake, but for the soul's sake, right? So let's start at the beginning, right? Or as we just imagine you just looking at the plate, right? So Seder in a lot of contexts just basically translates to order. And the way I think about it is that the ritual or the tradition or the holiday is an invitation for us to get our story in order, right? Not just historically, not the historical story, but the spiritual story. So the story in terms of what's happening right now at all times in eternity. So we can see each element not just, as I said, as a ritual, but as an allegory for the spiritual situation, for the spiritual journey. So this is meant to mirror the inner journey from what we might call bondage, which, the story of Passover, of Pesach, is about escaping from slavery, basically. You can see that so easily as like escaping or releasing ourselves from the bondage of the slavery of the ego, the way that the ego enslaves us to, if we want to think about it in sort of Buddhist terms, like of not just ignorance, but the samsaric wheel of suffering and urges and cravings, the sort of dark side of desire, you might say. And so, like I said, it kind of mirrors that journey from bondage to liberation, to freedom, to getting out of the place where we were enslaved, right? From fear to love, as maybe the Course might put it, A Course in Miracles, from ego to the truth, from the illusion of fear, the illusion of ego, the illusion of enslavement, even though in form it appears real and in the stories it really happened, but to love, to the only truth that there really is, in some ways to the ineffable truth. Like if we want to think about God in the way that, the Torah kind of like talks about it, it's in Judaism, at least in the way I grew up, God is ineffable. And I love that because I think that was the foundations for me being able to appreciate that when I had psychedelic experiences and felt like I couldn't put into words the reality of what I was experiencing. And sure enough, I was like, hey, they were right about that. Yeah, God is ineffable. Like, we can say God, but we know that it doesn't point nearly closely enough to the true reality. It does point, but it's as the Course talks about, it's a symbol of a symbol. And so we can recognize that and be appreciative of that. So we're going to kind of go through the steps of the Seder plate / like the whole ritual overall, like not just the literal items on the plate, but like kind of all the different aspects of the Haggadah, the script, sort of like the pieces themselves, the stories, the questions, all that stuff. So I'm definitely not meant to be an authoritative source on this information. I did some research to like reacclimate myself, but this is really more about bringing like sort of a learner's lens, a fellow traveler's lens on this journey to this. And hopefully, you can get some kind of questions come up in your mind as we go through this. So first we got the karpas, which is like these greens in salt water. When I was growing up as a kid, most of the time it was parsley. And you kind of like, if you're Jewish, you know what I'm talking about, but it's sort of an unmistakable texture where it's parsley that's dipped in salt water. And so it sort of represents the combination of two different things that in some ways are kind of opposites, but they're nevertheless so important. And I think it's a nice way to set the stage, right? So the green of like the parsley of this like saturated green color, it symbolizes life, renewal, sort of like springtime. I mean, we're in this part of the world, it really is springtime. So it kind of works very nicely. But sort of like, birth, like life, like when the plants grow, when we appreciate how everything is being born anew. But then the salt water that it's dipped in, like if you think of salty water, where else does salty sort of liquid come from? It comes from our eyes when we're crying. So it symbolizes the tears, the suffering that we've experienced due to the bondage. And so what's so interesting is that together they say that even with the sorrow, the suffering, the salt water, it waters the soil of our rebirth, that no matter what we've suffered, life is always possible. Life is always here. Life is always happening. And it's always a good time to recognize that I can be born again. I can renew my sense of life no matter what I've been through, right? And so a lot of the time, that's what spiritual growth feels like, right? I mean, we might have a dark night of the soul and be just steeped in the tears. And I've kind of talked about before that tears are the soul sweating. So it's the soul getting a great workout, because the soul suffering is not something that is bad, in from the perspective of the soul, from the perspective of spirit. It's just all love, right? So it's just one aspect of the divine. It's one aspect of love. And so spiritual growth can feel like the tears watering the soil to grow new life, to grow it's not even just new life, but like the ever-present life that's always here, right? So that sort of sets the stage for kind of like the threads that are coming together here, right? So next I want to get into kind of take a step back from the plate, because we've got that piece of the plate, but I want to talk about the 4 questions, because I think these really represent, and I guess sometimes it's 5 questions, but these really represent sort of the beginner's mind, the childlike sort of wonder and openness to what all of this could mean. So traditionally, and I remember as a kid asking this, like my parents had the script in front of us. We were a Jewish family, so we had the script. We didn't really know how things went and why it was what it was, but we went through the script and they were like, okay, Jack, or one of us kids, like, you now ask this question. And the 4/5 questions are meant to ask a question where we are not just trying to get the facts of like why this, why that, but to open ourselves through the symbolism of a child asking, but really it's all of us asking through the child. Like, how can I reflect? Be open for the storytelling, be open to the symbolism, which is a really beautiful thing to like start with that childlike wonder, that beginner's mind, like I said. And so the question basically boils down in a bunch of different forms to like, why this night? What makes this night, this day, in terms of like tonight or tomorrow night? It's the Seder itself. Like, what makes this different from other nights? Why are we, paying special attention to this? And it's a good question because from both perspectives, like from a child who doesn't know any better, like, why are we doing all this? Seems kind of silly, or this seems kind of interesting or weird, or hard to understand. But it's also like, why do we need this form? Why do we need any of this form to do it? So you can see how it comes from kind of two different perspectives that are both just sort of in a humble state of just asking the question to reinvigorate our understanding of the story and our understanding of its meaning. They kind of come in forms of like, all other nights we have challah, or we have, bread that rose and not this cracker-like thing called matzah. We might have really tasty sort of vegetables like carrots or broccoli or whatever. Not that those were tasty as a kid, but you know what I mean? As opposed to like bitter herbs, which we'll get to. And sort of like the way we dip the food or the way we're sitting or the way we're going through it. It's sort of just asking all that kind of stuff of what's all that about. And while as a kid, I didn't really understand what the purpose of me asking was, in some ways that makes it even better. Like, I don't even know why I'm asking this question. So they're really beautiful in that simplicity, right? They're not really theological questions per se. They're really just more like observant of like what's happening in the present moment, like what's going on here. And they're, like I said, they're spoken through the voice of the child. So I really, as I revisit this is a profound spiritual moment, and why I said all of us at the table are asking, what this means, what is going on here. And to tie it to the teachings of A Course in Miracles, there's a really beautiful question that is like one of the best questions you can ask in any situation, especially when it feels like you are perceiving it as bad or wrong or sinful, or I'm suffering, or I don't like this, which is asking the Holy Spirit, asking the bridge between heaven and earth, or heaven and hell, depending on how earth is for you. What is this for? What is this for? And not to assume that we know, because in letting go of the assumption that we know, or the belief that I need to know, that's when our highest self can come in and tell us, or really show us. And I think in some ways that's kind of what this ritual is it's the Holy Spirit showing us the power of these stories and the power of sort of aligning ourselves with an ultimately optimistic, but realistic and optimistic experience of the spiritual journey. So they really do help us come back to the present. Like, why is this moment different? And that awakening really does start with humility. It's as A Course in Miracles talks about, it's like you first say, this is not working. There must be a better way. There must be a better way. And when you say there must be a better way to live, a better way to experience reality, a better way to experience life, you're basically asking the question, can you help me? What is this for? What is all this? And that humility is really profound. So I mentioned matzah. So let's get into matzah, which is sort of, in a way, it represents some humility, but also urgency, right? Because this is, matzah is bread that didn't rise. And it didn't rise because they didn't have time to let it rise, because they needed to bring this bread, more like cracker, but matzah is really kind of its own thing. But I always thought of it as like this big, huge cracker as a kid. They were in haste. They were needing to flee from their captors in Egypt in haste, because it was like they're going to chase after them. So they didn't have time to let it rise, but they needed to bring food. And so matzah represents like certainly humility of being like, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm bringing whatever I got with me and let's go, but also the urgency of the spiritual transformation. When we feel like we've had enough with the wrong way, or listening to the ego as our God, to this lowercase s self as our God, there's an urgency to to just throw ourselves into spiritual transformation, into the journey, to, like I said, asking that question. And so for me, it really represents like this just totally stripped down honesty, where the proof of how honest it was is the fact that the bread is not even bread. Like, it hasn't even gotten to the chance to become bread, because we're like, screw the form, screw our sustenance. It doesn't have to look how it needs to look. I just need to be on this path, right? I just need to be on this path. So no ego puffing, just, like puffing of the bread. The ego didn't have time to puff the bread, just the presence of getting on this journey and bringing what we've got, and just sort of hoping for the best, having faith. So it's like, it's enough, like what I have to offer is enough. What I have to offer the body of my spiritual journey is enough. It's simple, but it's sacred, right? I mean, matzah's great. Matzah with I'll get to the charoset later, but having the matzah with hopefully that's not sacrilegious to have done that. I did it as a kid. No, I don't think it is. You can use a matzah however you want, but with a charoset, it's like the sweet kind of dip. I'll talk about it later. That was so good. I was a little allergic, I think, to like the nuts or something in it, but worth it. Okay, so let's get into the kind of two sets, you might say, or two pieces of the bitter herbs. So maror is kind of like, I guess it's the main one, but it's horseradish. So typically you just have some like horseradish on the plate, and I always liked that because I loved spicy stuff as a kid. And it is difficult, for most people to get down. It's kind of interesting now to think about that I enjoyed it so much, because it's, I think a lot of the time it's meant to represent that we don't skip over the difficult, spicy, sufferable like aspects of reality, right? Of experiencing. We taste it, we experience it fully, because we learn lessons when we allow ourselves to experience things fully. We don't avoid the difficult stuff. We taste the difficult stuff. We feel the grief throughout the healing process. We feel the grief when a loved one passes away, rather than, self-medicating through avoidance mechanisms, right? Through coping strategies that are ultimately okay, maybe in form, but they don't allow our soul to experience the lesson that it's here to learn. So, A Course in Miracles teaches that like what is unhealed must first be brought into the light. Like, it can't just stay in the darkness. And to me, I see that like just eating a big spoonful of horseradish and being like, oh God, as like bringing it into the light, bringing it into the awareness, right? And it's intense and it's a lot. And in some ways it can be funny, especially at the table when like a kid like me just eats the whole thing and my nostrils are on fire. And it stings, but it's, it frees you. The truth can hurt at first because we're not used to it, but it really is freeing. It's liberating. So then the other bitter herb, the chaseret, it's usually like, at least what I've seen, I can't remember exactly. I feel like we probably just had romaine lettuce, or we just had like another thing that was kind of more bitter or not quite as bitter or whatever. And I think what's interesting about this one, when I was kind of like doing some research today, because some of these I'm more familiar with and some of them I'm not as much. And I know not all of them are always included in the same way, depending on, your upbringing and how you celebrated and kind of what you had. But it's sort of, as opposed to the sting, it's that sometimes suffering has like a slow onset. It's like the other one is like quick release, and this one's like extended release suffering. Where like romaine lettuce, it starts sweet, but if you just have lettuce by itself with no dressing or anything on it, it kind of turns bitter a little bit as you keep chewing it, especially if you chew it for a while. And so the idea is like I said, there's like slow onset. So the pain is not necessarily immediate, and it sort of grows quietly and it's maybe unnoticed. And I think about this as like unhealthy, like relationship patterns in families, that you can have decades of engaging in these patterns with people, but they actually have toxic aspects to them. And then you might like erupt with frustration or anger. And I think this is really helpful because in a way, it's kind of like understanding that some aspects of our bondage are maybe not as obvious to us as we might expect them to be with the other form of this bitterness, right? So some of the things the ego does or says or convinces us of can seem like harmless at first, but taken over the course of years, like, oh, I could do this, thing, this unhealthy habit, once a day or whatever, and then it turns into a more attached, grippy habit over years and years and years. And you think about having like a drink a day turns into 3 drinks a day, turns into 4 drinks a day, turns into 5 drinks a day. And over the course of decades, that can have profound physical suffering implications for the body. And that's just one form, it cascades, addiction cascades. And so addiction is not the only aspect of this, but I think addiction is a good example. And it could be addiction to anything, right? Anything where you don't notice that it's causing you more suffering. And so I think it's sort of as opposed to the sting of the other form of bitterness, this is more of like a gentle reminder of like, what things am I not noticing? What assumptions do I have that are keeping me from seeing the way that a certain pattern or a certain habit might be not good for me, might be causing me greater suffering and might be causing me greater suffering later. So, okay, so this next one might be my favorite. I've mentioned it already. It was just, I don't know, it just felt like the most interesting piece. The maybe because it felt more artistic, but the charoset is like this, the sweet aspect. And typically, like I said, it's kind of like this dip where it's like a sweet sort of like, it's like sticky, everything's sticking together of typically like tiny chopped up apples and maybe nuts. And sort of it has this taste of wine in it. And maybe that's also why I was so interested in it, because I had never tasted wine at like 10 years old or whatever. And it symbolizes that, even in bondage, sweetness can still survive. There's a mixture of sweetness that is like tethered together by the stickiness of experience, that still survives. So like even when the Israelites were enslaved, they still had a sweetness to life. There was still something that could, sort of stick with them in a way, right? So I see this kind of as the symbolism of the resilience of joy, that even within difficulty, there's a divinity, there's a divine experience. And even in the hardest times of our life, the hardest seasons when we're wrapped up in this bondage, there is still the taste of something eternal. We always have access to the eternal, because the eternal is not a place that we try to get back to. The eternal is where we already are, and it's a matter of recognizing that we're already here, right? So this was, the next one is one that I don't think I ever really wanted to have, because it's lamb. So it's zeroa, I think is how you pronounce it. And it's like the shank bone, or like a roasted lamb shank bone, which symbolizes the sacrifice, I think, offered at the temple in Jerusalem. And I just didn't like lamb, and I still don't like lamb, but it's part of the plate. Got to talk about it. It's part of the symbolism. So as far as I can understand, it represents a protection that through the sacrifice, and by then marking the Israelites marking their doorposts with lamb's blood, when the plagues were happening, which we'll talk about that. If they sacrificed a lamb, marked their door with the lamb's blood, the plague would just pass over their homes without any issues, right? So for me, in some ways, this is a little bit more of like okay, what does this mean? What sacrifice protects us from the suffering, right? And I think, in A Course in Miracles, it talks about that there is no sacrifice, right? So how can I sort of understand it? I think surrender is actually probably a nice way to think about it, that surrendering the lamb, which is like surrendering my assumptions, surrendering my way of experiencing sustenance previously through the ego, and instead recognizing that there is a divine protection that I get when I surrender. And it's mysterious, like how it's mysterious that, whoa, like the plague was happening to all these people, but it didn't go over my house because I showed that I had sacrificed or I had surrendered. And So I think, it is a ritual from a different time and form, but I think extracting like this is something I talked about in the spiritual journey video, but like, how could this story be true? How can I not make it true, but like shift my understanding so that it's totally true without kind of compromising on my ability to discern what's true. I think the inner sacrifice, it seems like sacrifice to the ego, but it's really just surrender. It's just surrendering what is not useful, surrendering what is not helpful, surrendering what is unneeded or harmful. Like we hold the bone as a reminder that sacrifice is actually not a loss. We don't lose anything when we sacrifice or surrender, but it's actually through that surrender that it's a gateway to being unharmed by the suffering that the ego causes us, to the mystery that we are cared for, that through our divine connection, our divine recognition, we are saved. We are able to remain at peace. If you have any thoughts about how you would interpret that particular part of the allegory, I'm super open to that. So definitely let me know. Okay, then there's the matzah, I think. It's like the egg, which is on the plate. And I believe it's not eaten. It's just left there. It symbolizes like if we're just leaving it, recognizing that it's there. And what is an egg, right? An egg hatches and it reveals new life in it. I go back to kind of what we talked about in terms of the parsley and of being born again, renewal, life, rebirth. I think of that as like the resurrection, not necessarily, obviously, since we're in a Jewish context, the resurrection of Jesus, but I mean, to connect it to that, like it's the resurrection of our inner Jesus, of our inner Christ, of our highest self, of our godhood, of our divinity. And so I think in one sense, like an egg that is unhatched can cause us grief, right? To life that was not able to kind of come into its own, to be recognized as life, is a reason to grieve. But at the same time, it's an opportunity for rebirth. It's an egg. Anytime you see an egg is a potential for rebirth. That paradox is actually really helpful. It's both a memorial of what had seemingly died or not been able to be given life, but also the seed of new life. And so that grief is holy, right? It's an opportunity, just like all of these symbols, to remind us of the divine. Every ending, is an opening. Every door that closes, it's another door that opens, that kind of thing. The form will dissolve. Like all form will go back to its formless state. It just goes from formless to form, back to formless to form, back to formless. What it always pointed to was this ever-changing eternity of life, and that always remains. So it's sort of like if we allow ourselves to feel the grief will dissolve and pass, and then what will be revealed is the truth. And if we don't allow ourselves to feel the grief, if we don't recognize the grief, we'll be caught up in the darkness of avoiding it, unable to see the truth because we're caught up in that samsaric wheel. So okay, so this is a cool one. I didn't mention this, but related to the matzah, early in the Seder, we, like break a piece of it in half. One piece stays at the table and the other, which is the afikoman, is hidden. And then the idea is like toward the end, it reminds me actually of Easter, because I also celebrated Easter. It was more cultural celebration where we looked for the eggs and the stuff like that. But the children like search for that other piece of matzah. And I specifically remember like one time finding it. It was in a napkin so that it was kind of hidden. And this is like a beautiful metaphor, like the children searching for the other half, the hidden half. So the piece that stays at the table, right, that we could say is like the version of us that goes through form and the ego's experience. But it's, and then the other half is like our true self that we're searching for. We're searching for our divine connection, but in a playful way, right? It's like the child, we're all children on the spiritual journey when we are awakening out of the grip of the ego, right? So it's both playful and powerful, I think. Something whole had been broken. Something whole had been broken, and a piece of it that was an integral piece to what had been broken before was hidden from us. I've heard people talk about how, like, when they, and this is the case for me for sure, like psychedelic experiences, you come to recognize or meet a part of yourself you forgot was there. Like, to me, that's what the broken piece of the matzah, the afikoman, represents, because it's like, it's rediscovering a part of you you forgot what's there. And the child does it, right? Because, like, when I was on a psychedelic and on a trip and experiencing it, I felt like a child. I felt like, whoa, what is this, right? So in some ways, it's kind of like the prodigal child kind of story from the Bible. It's like you come back home and you're treated with the innocence of a child. You know, in the prodigal son story, the father, he just welcomes his child back like he had never, like, not like he had never left, but like he was completely forgiven, completely innocent. And the child searching for the afikoman is kind of representative of that. And we do it together. The children do it together, right? We're all children searching for that hidden part of ourselves. And a lot of the time I felt like it was in a more obvious place than I realized. And I think that's a beautiful way to recognize it, that actually that hidden part is closer than the tip of your nose, right? That love that you are, that was broken off from the suffering part of you, the part that got entrapped by the ego, and maybe is the ego in some cases. It's beautiful to rediscover it. So the separated self comes home, or recognizes that it never left, returning to the capital S self. And in the end, it's not that we earn the afikoman through searching for it. We just find it through our own surrender, through our own recognition that it never really left us in the first place. And so we're reunited with what never truly was lost. But it's such a beautiful game, like as part of it. So it's not part of the plate itself, but so integral to the meaning of this allegory, right? So a couple more things to talk about. I know this is kind of a long episode today, but I think it's so fun to like deep dive into this and like revisit these things. So hopefully you enjoy this too, and get some meaning out of it. So the 10 plagues, right? I talked about the sacrifice of the lamb and putting the lamb's blood on the doors to avoid, the plagues coming to you. So we recite all the plagues that were sent onto Egypt, whether it's the raining blood or the frogs or the lice, locusts, whatever, like reaching the firstborn children of all these places. And that's interesting. Like the idea that the one who was firstborn, the firstborn being the capital S self, had to go into lowercase s self and experience the egoic tragedies. As far as I'm aware, with each like mention, we remove a drop of wine from our cup. And so we're recognizing that even in our liberation, we mourn and appreciate and are compassionate to the suffering. I think about A Course in Miracles when it says, love does not condemn. Right? Like, even though love, reality, truth recognizes that this world of suffering of the ego is an illusion, it doesn't condemn it by saying, you're not real, because that is a totally non-compassionate way to approach it. Love doesn't condemn it, it uses it. Yes, there was a victory of escaping the bondage of the ego. Not everyone is in that place. And so even in liberation, we mourn the suffering, we rejoice in victory, but not in the pain of others, not in the suffering of others. We're never healed alone. The healing journey, the spiritual journey, awakening is not one we take alone. The Israelites coming out of Egypt, they weren't alone. We're in relationship with other people, and we appreciate even those that aren't on the journey, but are figuring themselves out, and whatever part of the journey that they're on, they're a part of God's children. They're a part of this. Even if we all are on different stages of the journey, it's recognizing that we don't leave anyone behind in our hearts. I see in some ways the plagues is like these reflections of what can fall away, and each thing falls away. And as it falls away, to other people, it might look like grief. It might look like tragedy. It might really hurt, right? So it's the old mindsets. It's the false idols, the grievances we have, as the Course says, like, I no longer hold any grievances. Letting go of those can be tragic, can feel like grief. Okay, so the last of the symbols that we've got here. And so Elijah's cup, right? This is the what I would say is like the open door to redemption, to awakening, to salvation, to transformation. So at a certain point in the Seder, right, we pour a cup of wine and set it aside specifically for Elijah. And my family, at least a few times, we literally opened the door for Elijah to enter. And symbolically, this is like a moment where we welcome the redemption. We say, my door, my heart, my mind is open to the truth. It's what I said earlier about A Course in Miracles, when it's like you say, there must be another way. What is this for? Or just help. And it's just opening the door and all of us doing it together and saying, I'm ready, I'm open, I'm willing. It's not just hope, though, because we are setting the intention. So it's faith or faithful expectation that Elijah is coming. I always thought Elijah was the Messiah, but the idea is Elijah announces the Messiah. So Elijah is like the one who comes and says, the Messiah is coming, or the Messiah is here, the coming of the new age. So for me, though, in my own path, I see this cup that we leave out as always leaving a space in my heart, in my mind for Spirit. Always saying, Spirit, Holy Spirit, you are welcome. I embrace you. I listen to you. What will you have me do now? What will you have me do next? What will you have me see? What is the truth that I am to see here? Elijah's cup is recognizing, I don't know what this is for. I just know that this is coming, and I surrender, and I'm receptive to what's coming. I am ready for miracles. A Course in Miracles says, it talks about miracle readiness. I'm ready for miracles. And we don't drink it because it's the cup that we wait with. And it stays full because the faith that we have in it is enough. The surrender of what the cup represents is enough. We don't need to drink it in form, because we will have our deliverance in the formless, in the spiritual. So, like I was saying, the story isn't just history. I think of it as like a spiritual map, an allegory, a map of the soul, a soul's map to, redemption, to coming home to the home we never left but thought we did, and recognizing that you can be Jewish but have a spiritual practice, a deep spiritual practice, and appreciate the rich tradition that is Judaism and the rich rituals and holidays that we get to celebrate. And no matter how you celebrate, right? You can bring your full self to the table, any table, old, new, and of course, eternal. And I would say that this way of understanding the Passover, of understanding that I'm passed over from the plague. The suffering passes over me because I have surrendered to the divine, that I'm passed over in terms of being passed over in grace, that God's grace allows me to pass over the suffering. I want to close now with a blessing. If you have any ideas, thoughts, questions, concerns, reflections yourself, would love to hear it. Did you find this helpful at all? If you're coming from the outside in, and if you're coming from the inside out, did you find this interesting at all? Or did it make you think a little bit differently about anything? But nonetheless, I always come back to this experience of how could this story, this ritual, this tradition be true? What is true about this? God of all names and no name, who leads us out of the narrow places. May we remember that liberation is not just a story from long ago, but it's a call today, right now, to leave behind what no longer serves us. May the matzah teach us simplicity and urgency and humility. May the maror teach us truth. May the charoset teach us the sweetness to never forget. And the salt water teach us to let the tears fall, to let our souls sweat. May the questions awaken our curiosity, and the 4 cups awaken our willingness. And may Elijah's cup remain on our table always, a sign that even when we feel stuck, no matter how stuck, there is something in us that still believes, still has faith, still waits, is still receptive to the miracle of our redemption, and still knows that love is our birthright, peace is our inheritance, and freedom, true eternal freedom, is not just possible, it is already ours at home in God. Amen. And so it is. Chag Sameach. Chag Sameach, Chag Sameach, la 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 la. Chag Sameach, Chag Sameach, la 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 la. Shir, 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 Chag Sameach, la 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 la. Shir, 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 Chag Sameach, la la la.